Hello and welcome to part 3 of the Python series. In this video, we'll be talking about the print function along with the different types of variables and data types. So let's start off by talking about what print is. Print is a very important function, although it may just seem like it does very little. Print allows for the user to see something on their end. So after the code is executed, you might want to print the result. So this is what's shown to the user. Now let's start by simply just printing hello world. In order to do that, you type in print and then you open the parentheses. You either use quotations or you use a set of apostrophes. Type in your string. And the reason why we use apostrophes or these quotations is because we're telling the computer that it's a string and it's not a variable. Otherwise, it will search the code for that variable and it will attempt to find it. And also, it only searches the variables that are above it because those are the saved ones. Okay. If we print this and run it, we get hello world as our output. Now, let's talk a bit about what variables are. So in the last video, I talked about naming x as a variable and storing numbers in that variable. Variables can be named any way that you would like, as long as they don't have key aspects of Python, such as the dot, or they have a star, or they have spaces in between them. That can mess up the assignment of the variable. So let's make sure that we appropriately name all of the variables so that it's easier in the future to be able to access them. In this tutorial, I'm just going to use num. So num is our variable, and I'm going to set it equal to 6. This is basically saying that 6 is equal to num, or num is equal to 6. It's important to make sure that the variable is always on the left side of the equals sign, otherwise it will not recognize it as a variable. Okay, now it's also important to make sure that you don't define another value by the same variable, and if you were to, it will change the value to the one that's further down the list. And for example, if I were to print this num, I made another variable called num, and then I set it equal to 8. The value will mutate, and you will be left with 8 rather than 6. So it's important that you set different variables so that this mutation doesn't occur. Now let's talk a bit about different types of data that you can store in Python or in your variables. Let's start by talking about what string is. So string is just a storage of text or words or even a letter. Next, we have int. Int is basically an integer, and it stores integer values. So it does not store any decimals or fractions, so it's really important that that is taken into account. Next, we have float. Float values also encompass decimal values, which is different from integers. For example, you can store maybe 5.9 in a float, but if you were to make that an integer, it would truncate the decimal and only result with 5. So it does not round, it just gets rid of the decimal if you define it as an integer. Next, we have bool, which only stores true or false values. And lastly, we have none. This stores nothing. So that's important in some situations. Now, let's go back to the scenario where we were talking about num, and we originally had it set to 6. Over here, the program automatically identifies that it is an integer, but in order to make sure, you might want to type in that it is an integer and define it. So if I were to print it now, I get 6. In the same scenario, if I were wanting to print 6.9, but I use the integer, it will only print 6 because it truncates the decimal value. In order to make sure that doesn't happen, we need to define it as a float. You can also remove the float part, but it's important sometimes to just define it and make sure that it runs smoothly that way. So here I have 6.9. Next, we have string. So let's talk about string and what would happen. So string values are basically just words or phrases. So in this case, I might just type in the parentheses and say hello, and I want it to print the hello statement, and I defined it as num. So when I execute, it will say hello. So this is basically being defined as a string with this function. Now let's talk about bool. So what is bool? Bool is something that only stores true or false values. So if I were to type in true, notice how this is capital, the T is capital, and same with false. So that's important syntax. You end up with true here. If I type in false, you will get false. So it only stores those values. And let's say, for example, I go back to my 6.9 example and I keep that there. If I were to type that in and save it as a bool, I would get true. Any value that's not 0, so let me type that out. Any value that's not 0, not none, or if there's nothing in there, if it's just 2 brackets or 2 parentheses just there, then it will return true. So just to show how that works, type in 0. Oh, and also false gives you false. That gives you false. If I don't have anything there, that will also give you false. And let's do none. That will give you false.